It started the way most dangerous things do, quietly, and with complete disregard for her plans. Maisie had worked the Friday night shift at Alara for almost 2 years, and she knew every face that walked through those lacquered black doors. She knew the investment bankers who ordered Barolo and mispronounced it. She knew the older couples celebrating anniversaries they barely acknowledged. She knew the regulars who tipped well and the ones who tipped like it was an act of charity. She knew this restaurant the way she knew the back of her own hand, every dim-lit corner, every creak in the hardwood floor, every trick of the mirror behind the bar that made the room look twice as large and twice as golden. What she did not know, on that particular Friday in late October, was the man at table 7. He had arrived at 8:47 in the evening. She remembered the time because she had been refilling water glasses along the far wall when she heard the shift in the room, not a sound exactly, more like a change in pressure, the way the air behaves before a storm decides to announce itself. She turned and saw him being escorted to the corner table by Marcus, the maitre d', who was walking with the particular stiffness that meant he was nervous. The man sat down without looking at the menu. He said something to Marcus in a low voice, and Marcus nodded 3 times in quick succession. Then the man was alone, and the room continued around him as if nothing had changed, but Maisie could feel it, the slight recalibration. The way other diners seemed to unconsciously angle away from that corner. The way the low jazz from the speakers felt suddenly inappropriate, like background noise at a funeral. She went back to her section. She had 4 tables that night, none of them table 7, and she told herself she had no reason to look again. She looked again. He was perhaps 40, though he carried it the way certain men do, like age was a credential rather than a condition. Dark hair, silver at the temples. A jaw that seemed carved from something difficult. He was wearing a charcoal suit with no tie, the collar of his shirt open one button, and he sat with the absolute stillness of a man who had never once fidgeted in his life. There was a glass of water in front of him and nothing else, and he was staring at her. Not glancing. Not occasionally catching her eye. Staring, with the patient, unhurried focus of someone who had decided that was what he was going to do, and had no particular concern about being noticed doing it. Maisie turned away. She delivered an appetizer to table 3. She smiled at the couple on table 9, who were celebrating something and wanted everyone to know it. She crossed the restaurant twice, refilled a bread basket, checked on a soufflé. Each time she moved, she felt his gaze like a fixed point in the room, not threatening exactly, not aggressive. Just absolutely, unervingly present. She stopped by the bar and found Dominic, the floor manager, adjusting a cocktail garnish. "Who is table 7?" she asked, keeping her voice light. Dominic didn't look up immediately. When he did, there was something careful in his expression. "Reservation under Tereshko." "Tereshko," she repeated. "He's a regular, apparently. First time at this location." Dominic paused. "Maisie. Don't what? Whatever face you're about to make." She smoothed her expression. "I'm not making a face. I'm asking a simple question about a customer. Then the simple answer is, he's very important, he's very well connected, and if he wants something, the answer is yes." Dominic finally looked at her properly. "Which doesn't mean he's going to want anything. He's probably just eating dinner." Maisie nodded once, professionally, and walked back to her section. He was still staring. She had been stared at before. She was a tall black woman with natural hair she wore in a high puff on Friday nights because the kitchen was warm and she ran hot, and she had a face that people tended to look at, high cheekbones, a mouth that went serious before the rest of her did, dark eyes that her grandmother had always called old soul eyes, though Maisie had never been quite sure if that was a compliment. She was used to attention. She had spent 27 years learning to navigate it, the good kind, the bad kind, the kind that required a firm word, the kind that could be safely ignored. This felt like none of those categories. This felt like being observed by someone who was genuinely, carefully, deeply curious about her. As if she were a painting he hadn't seen before and was trying to understand before he formed an opinion. It was unsettling because it wasn't predatory. It was almost respectful. And that, somehow, was worse. She had decided to ignore it entirely when table 4's order came up wrong and she had to cut across the restaurant to speak to the kitchen, which took her directly past table 7. She kept her eyes forward and her shoulders square, and she was 3 steps past when she heard his voice. "Excuse me." 2 words. Low and accented, Russian or something close to it, not heavy, but present, the consonants slightly weighted, the vowels clear. She stopped because she was at work, and stopping was the professional thing to do, and she turned with exactly the expression she used for every customer at every table in this restaurant. "Can I help you?" she said. He was looking up at her with a directness that was somehow both intense and calm. Up close, his eyes were a very pale gray, light in a way that seemed almost wrong given the heaviness of the rest of him. "You're not my server," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you're the only one who has looked at me like you disapprove of my existence." She held the professional expression with some effort. "I don't disapprove of your existence." "No?" The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, just an acknowledgement. "You've been clocking every time I look at you. Most people find it uncomfortable to be stared at for 40 minutes. "I know," he said simply. "I was curious whether you'd say something." "I'm saying something now." "Yes." He tilted his head slightly. "You are." He looked at her for another beat, unhurried, as if there were no restaurant around them, no ambient noise, no timeline at all. "Nikolai," he said. "Since we're past formalities." "We're not past formalities," Maisie said, because she wasn't going to give him her name for no reason, and also because some animal instinct at the back of her brain was saying very quietly but very clearly that this man was not a normal dinner customer and the ground beneath this conversation was softer than it appeared. He accepted that without reaction. "Your section is tables 2 through 6, he said. "You've been covering for someone on 9 and 11. You work quickly and you don't apologize when you don't need to." A pause. "I wasn't staring to make you uncomfortable. I was staring because you are the only genuinely competent person in this room." Maisie blinked. "Good night," she said, and walked to the kitchen. She stood at the pass and breathed for exactly 4 seconds. Then she fixed the order for table 4 and did not look at table 7 for the rest of the night. He came back the following Friday. Same time. Same table. Same suit, different color, navy this time, still no tie. He ordered sparkling water and a single plate of food, ate it with the focused efficiency of someone who viewed eating as a function rather than a pleasure, and for the entire first hour, he didn't look at her once. Maisie, to her considerable irritation, noticed. She hadn't thought about him during the week. That was what she told herself, and it was mostly true. She had thought about the other things she always thought about, which were her sister's upcoming tuition bill, the sublease that was ending in December, the graduate school application she had been almost finishing for 8 months. She had a full and continuous internal life that had nothing to do with a gray-eyed man in a corner table, and the fact that she had walked into work that Friday with a faint heightened awareness that she was immediately ashamed of was simply a product of the strangeness of the previous week. Adrenaline memory. Nothing more. He looked at her at 9:15. She felt it before she confirmed it, that same fixed-point sensation, the place in the room her awareness kept returning to like a tongue to a sore tooth. She looked back. He held her gaze for 3 seconds with that same patient, undisturbed focus, and then he returned to his water glass. It happened like that 4 more times before her shift ended. When she came out of the back at 11:30 in her coat, the restaurant nearly empty, he was still at the table. He was looking at his phone and didn't appear to notice her. She was almost to the door when she heard him. "Maisie." She stopped. She turned. He was still looking at his phone. She said, "You asked my name." "Yes." He looked up then. "I'd like to have coffee with you." "Not here." "Somewhere you choose, so you feel safe." "Tomorrow, if you're free." "Or another time." He said it with no particular expectation in his voice, the way he might relay information. "Not a performance. You can say no. I will continue eating here on Fridays and I will not make it strange." Maisie looked at him for a long moment. There was something infuriating about how straightforward he was. No performance, no pressure, no charm offensive. Just the fact of the request, stated plainly, offered and released. I don't know you, she said. That's the point of the coffee. I know your name is Nikolai Tereshko. She watched his face. I know you have a reservation at Alara in 3 other cities. I know that when you walked in last week, Marcus looked like he might need to sit down. She paused. I know that whoever you are, you're not just a man who eats dinner alone on Fridays. Something shifted in his expression, the first real crack in that even composure. Not alarm exactly. Something closer to assessment. You researched me, he said. I like to know who I'm dealing with. And what did you find? Enough to have questions. A pause. The last server was clearing a far table, completely ignoring them with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned not to witness things in this restaurant. Then come for coffee, Nikolai said, and ask them. She chose the cafe herself, a corner place in her neighborhood, deliberately unfancy, with good light and the kind of noise level that made private conversation possible. She arrived 7 minutes early, which she told herself was habit, and chose a table near the window, which she told herself was preference. He arrived exactly on time. He was in dark jeans and a gray sweater, no suit, and it disoriented her slightly. He looked almost normal, which she had not expected and which was somehow more unsettling than the formality. He ordered black coffee, she ordered oat milk flat white, and for the first few minutes they talked about nothing, the neighborhood, the cafe, whether the autumn had turned cold early this year. He was a good listener in a way that felt active rather than performative. He asked questions that were specific rather than general, which meant he was actually paying attention, which she noted and filed. Then she said, You run the Tereshko organization. He didn't flinch. Yes. Bratva. A formal structure that no longer fully applies. But close enough. Maisie wrapped both hands around her coffee. So what are you doing asking me to coffee? I told you. I wanted to talk to you. Men like you don't just want to talk. He looked at her steadily. Men like me, he said, repeating the phrase without mockery. And what am I like? Powerful. Careful. Used to getting what you want without having to explain why you want it. She met his eyes. The staring wasn't just curiosity. You were deciding something. A long beat. Yes, he said. About me. Yes. I'd like to know what. He set his coffee down. Outside the window, the street moved in its ordinary Saturday morning way, a woman with a stroller, a man on a bicycle, 2 teenagers sharing headphones. And at this table, something that didn't fit any of it. I've been running the organization for 11 years, Nikolai said quietly. I have people around me constantly, people who want things, people who are afraid of me, people who tell me what they think I want to hear. I have had relationships that were strategic and relationships that were sincere, and I have learned over time to distinguish the two. What I have never had, he paused, just briefly, is someone who looked at me like I was an inconvenience they were deciding whether to tolerate. Something in Maisie's chest did a thing she would have preferred it not do. You liked that, she said. I found it remarkable. He looked at her. You are remarkably unbothered by things that frighten most people. I noticed that last Friday. I came back to see if I was right. A pause. I was right. Being unbothered doesn't mean I'm not paying attention, she said. No, he agreed. It means the opposite. They sat with that for a moment. I'm not in your world, she said finally. I'm a floor server at a restaurant who has a lease ending in December and an application to a graduate program in urban policy that I keep almost submitting. My life is, she gestured vaguely, normal. Functional. Mine. I know. I'm not interested in being pulled into anything. I'm not trying to pull you anywhere. Then what are you trying to do? He looked at her with those light gray eyes, and for the first time she thought she saw something in them that was not calm, something quieter and less armored. I'm trying, he said carefully, to have a conversation with someone who will tell me the truth. Maisie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What's your organization involved in right now that's keeping you up at night?" He blinked. And then, for the first time, he laughed, a short, genuine sound that was clearly not something he did often, and which rearranged his face into something that was considerably more human and considerably more dangerous. "You just asked me that," he said. "You said you wanted the truth. That requires reciprocity." He looked at her for a long time. "Consolidation problems," he said finally. "Someone inside is moving against the structure. I don't yet know who." She nodded slowly. "That's why you're in this city." "Partly." "And the other part?" A pause. "The other part," he said, "is sitting across from me." They had coffee 3 more times in November. Just coffee, no dinners, no evenings, no invitations into the larger architecture of his life. He came to her neighborhood each time, which she understood was deliberate. He was keeping her world separate from his, or at least trying to. She appreciated the effort without fully trusting it. What she had not anticipated was how much she would look forward to those hours. He was not an easy person. He said difficult things plainly, without softening them, and he expected the same in return. He had opinions that challenged her and a silence that sometimes lasted long enough to make her question everything she'd just said, until she understood that the silence wasn't disagreement, it was him actually thinking before he spoke, which was, she was coming to realize, an exceptionally rare quality. He asked about her graduate application with the focused interest of someone who had read the program details, which turned out to be true, he had, which should have unsettled her and instead produced the traitorous warmth she had been trying to manage since the first Friday. In return, she learned things carefully. That he had grown up in St. Petersburg in a household where silence was the main language. That he had entered the organization at 19 not through ambition but necessity, in the way that words like necessity cover a landscape of things a person doesn't choose. That he ran the organization with a kind of exhausted competence, not loving it, not leaving it, carrying it the way you carry something that has grown into your spine. That he had not laughed as freely as he laughed with her in a very long time, which he admitted once in November with the flatness of someone reporting a fact they found mildly interesting. "You should do it more," she said. "Laugh? Look like a person," she said. He looked at her. "Is that what it is?" "It's what it looks like from here." The 4th coffee became dinner because she suggested it impulsively and he accepted before she finished the sentence, and dinner lasted 3 hours, during which she told him things she hadn't told anyone, about her mother's illness 4 years ago, about the year she had spent just managing rather than living, about the way she had rebuilt herself into someone she actually recognized. He listened with his whole attention, which was the most intimate thing anyone had offered her in recent memory. She drove home afterward feeling like the atmospheric pressure had changed. She sat in her car outside her building and told herself, firmly and with some desperation, that she was not falling for a man who ran a criminal organization. The problem was that the man in her head was not an abstraction. He was specific, the way he held his cup, the pause before he said anything important, the look he had given her at the restaurant table that first night that she had classified as a stare but that she now understood was something closer to recognition. The way he'd said the other part is sitting across from me with no performance, no decoration, just the plain fact of it. She submitted her graduate application that night. She didn't know exactly why, except that something about those evenings had returned her to herself, to the version of her that believed her own future was worth investing in. She submitted it and then sat with her hands in her lap for a moment, feeling something she recognized, after a delay, as possibility. The shift happened in the first week of December. She was coming out of a late shift, 11:45, the street quiet and cold, pulling on her gloves as she came down the back steps. The car was parked 3 blocks away. She had her keys out, her mind already on the warmth of her apartment, when she became aware of 2 men walking behind her, not unusual, not immediately alarming, except for the angle of approach, too close to the building, maintaining her pace rather than their own. She adjusted her route without appearing to, angling toward the more lit stretch of street. They adjusted too. That was when her chest went cold. She had her phone out and was pulling up Nikolai's number, a decision she clocked even as she made it, noting that it was the first number she reached for, noting what that meant, when a third man appeared from the corner ahead and the intent became entirely clear. She stopped walking. She was calculating, sound, distance, doorway, whether screaming would do anything other than satisfy her, when headlights swung into the street and a black car decelerated sharply and two of Nikolai's people were out of it before it had fully stopped. They were not gentle. There were words in Russian she didn't know and a speed of resolution that told her this was not improvised. The men were gone, not arrested, just gone, in under 2 minutes, and then one of Nikolai's men was asking if she was hurt, and she was saying no, she was fine, she was completely fine, in the voice she used when she wanted something to be true enough that saying it would help. Nikolai arrived 8 minutes later. He was out of a separate car, in a coat over what appeared to be a dress shirt, and she could see by the set of his face that he had been somewhere else and left quickly. He stopped in front of her and his eyes moved over her, a rapid, contained assessment, and then he said, "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she said. "That's not what I asked." "I'm not hurt." She stopped. Something had loosened in her chest that she needed to not loosen in the middle of a cold December street. "I'm shaken. I'm angry. I need someone to explain to me what that was about." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said quietly to his man, "Wait at the car," and they were alone on the street. "The consolidation problem," he said. "They were sending you a message." "Yes." "Through me." "Yes." His jaw tightened. "They've been watching our meetings. They identified you as," he paused, "significant." The word landed. Maisie looked at him. "I told you," she said, and her voice was steady but not even, "that I was not interested in being pulled into anything." "I know. You told me you were keeping it separate." "I believed I was. And yet." She gestured at the empty street. He held her gaze. There was no deflection in him, no self-protection, just the fact of it, owned. "I was wrong," he said. "I underestimated how quickly they would move. I should have had protection on you weeks ago. I didn't because I knew you would refuse it and because he stopped. Because you what?" A pause. "Because I wanted to believe that this part of my life could exist without contaminating you." He said it quietly and without ornamentation. "I was wrong. And you were nearly hurt because of it. There is nothing I can say that is adequate to that." Maisie stood in the cold for a long moment. There was anger in her, real, legitimate anger, the kind that had every right to be there. And underneath it, something she was less prepared for, the fact that he had come here himself, in 8 minutes, in a dress shirt in December. The fact that the first thing he had done was look for her injury, not for the men. The fact that he looked, now, not powerful or composed but stripped, like a man who had made a mistake and knew the cost and was not going to minimize it. "I need to know," she said finally, "what is happening. Not a summary. Not what you think I can handle. What is actually happening." He looked at her. "Come inside somewhere warm and I'll tell you all of it." They sat in his car with the heat running and he told her. The man moving against him was Gregor Lash, nominally his number 2, in practice an adversary who had been building quietly for 2 years. Lash had decided that Nikolai's recent changes to the organization's operations, a gradual, deliberate movement away from certain activities, toward more legitimate financial structures, were a threat to the old guard's interests. He was right, they were. That was the point. Nikolai had been engineering a long transition, the kind that takes years and requires maintaining the appearance of continuity while hollowing it out from the inside, and Lash had either discovered the real scope of it or made an educated guess, and was now applying pressure at every edge he could find. Maisie was an edge he had found. "He'll use you to destabilize me," Nikolai said. "Or he'll try to. If he can demonstrate that I've created a vulnerability, that there's someone I would make decisions about in order to protect," he stopped. "He can use me as leverage," she said. "Yes." She processed this. "What are your options?" He looked at her with a slight shift in expression. She had noticed he did this when she said something that surprised him, not shock exactly but a kind of recalibration. "Most people," he said, in this situation, are asking what they should do. I'm not most people. She held his gaze. You have more information than I do. Tell me the options. He was quiet for a moment. I can resolve the Lash situation. That takes time, perhaps 6 to 8 weeks, and in that time you are at risk unless you accept protection. Which I don't want. I know. What else? He paused. The other option is that I end contact with you. Completely and demonstrably. If Lash's people believe you're no longer significant, the threat is reduced. The interior of the car was quiet. Outside, the street was still empty. Maisie looked at her hands. She thought about November, the coffees, the dinners, the particular quality of his attention, the way she had driven home after the third dinner feeling more herself than she had in a year. She thought about submitting the application. She thought about the plain, undecorated way he had said the other part is sitting across from me. And what do you want to do? She asked. He turned to look at her directly, and she saw it again, that stripped quality, no performance, no management. I want to tell you that you should make this decision based entirely on what is safe for you, he said. And I want to tell you that I would very much like for you not to decide that this, he gestured slightly, indicating the space between them, is something you're willing to walk away from. Both of those things are true simultaneously, she observed. Yes. That's your version of honesty. It's the only version I have. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the protection. What does that actually look like? He blinked, then answered, a car on the block, a contact to check in with, 2 of his most trusted people rotating. Not intrusive. She would know they were there, that was the point. She thought about the 2 men behind her on the street, the angle of approach, the cold. 6 to 8 weeks, she said. If everything goes correctly. And if it doesn't? Then longer. Or a different solution. He held her gaze. I won't lie to you about the timeline being certain. She respected that more than she wanted to. Okay, she said. Okay, which part? The protection. The 6 to 8 weeks. She paused, not walking away. She looked at him steadily. But I need you to understand that I am not a piece on your board. If you start making decisions about my life without telling me, I will walk away. Not because I'm afraid. Because I don't belong to anyone's strategy, including yours. Something in his face settled, not relief exactly, something deeper. I understand, he said. Say it back. A pause. Then, quietly, you are not part of my strategy. You are the exception to it. And you will be consulted, always. He held her eyes. I give you my word. Maisie looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, okay. Take me home. The weeks that followed were unlike anything she had a ready category for. She went to work. She continued her application process. She had an interview for the program in the second week of December, which she prepared for with the focus of someone who had decided their life was still their project. She had dinner with her sister, who asked about the car parked outside and accepted the answer work thing with the trusting and curiosity of someone who trusted her. She lived her life, fully and deliberately, and in the background of it were 2 quiet, unobtrusive presences who checked in via text each morning and evening and otherwise remained invisible. And there was Nikolai. He came for coffee twice a week, always to her neighborhood, always in the ordinary civilian clothes that she had come to realize he wore like a second language, not naturally, but fluently, code-switched. He was dealing with the Lash situation in ways he told her about in careful, edited summaries, which she pushed on until the summaries became fuller, and he let himself be pushed, which was something she noticed. He was not a man who was accustomed to being held accountable for his own narratives. She held him accountable anyway. She also, in the privacy of her own apartment, allowed herself to acknowledge what was happening to her. She had tried framing it as fascination. He was an unusual person in an unusual situation and she was a naturally curious person and that was all this was. She had tried framing it as circumstance, forced proximity, heightened stakes, the intimacy that gets produced by shared tension. Both framings dissolved the moment she saw him walking down her street toward the cafe, hands in pockets, and felt the specific, embarrassingly simple warmth of being glad that someone was arriving. She was falling in love with him. She had probably started in October, at that table in the cafe when he'd said, "I'm trying to have a conversation with someone who will tell me the truth." She had recognized something in it, not a line, not a performance, but a genuine need, stated without shame, offered to her as plainly as a hand extended across the table. She had not told him this. She was not going to tell him this until the present situation was resolved, because she was not going to say that particular thing while she had two of his people parked outside her building and her life had been indirectly reorganized by his circumstances. She would say it when she was standing on her own ground. That was non-negotiable. What she did not expect was that he would say something first. It was a Thursday, 2 weeks before Christmas, gray and cold, the city already decorated with the determined commercial optimism of the season. They were at the cafe, finishing coffee, and she had been talking about her interview. It had gone well, she thought, she would know by January, and he had been listening in that particular way, fully present, when she caught him looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the assessment of the first night. Not the careful curiosity of November. Something quieter and more exposed. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He looked away briefly, then back. "I was thinking." "I can see that." "What about?" A pause. "About what this is," he said. "What I would call it, if I were being accurate." Maisie went still. He looked at her steadily. "I don't say things I don't mean," he said. "You know that. So I'm going to say this once, clearly, and you don't have to respond to it in any particular way." He held her gaze. "I am in love with you. I have been for some time. I think it started when you told me good night in the restaurant as if you were dismissing a minor inconvenience, and it has become something that is," he paused, briefly, "significant. To me." The cafe continued around them. Someone ordered something at the counter. The door opened, cold air briefly, then closed. Maisie said, very carefully, "You're doing the thing where you state facts plainly so I can't accuse you of performing." "Yes. That's annoying." Something moved in his eyes, that barely their shift. "I know." She looked at him. She thought about the ground she had promised herself to stand on before she said anything. She thought about the circumstances, the men on the street, the car outside her building. She thought about her rule. Then she thought about the fact that she was sitting across from a man who had just offered her the most undefended thing she had ever been offered, and who was sitting perfectly still waiting for her response with no pressure and no expectation, only the particular dignity of someone who has said a true thing and is prepared to have it received however it is received. "I'm not going to say anything back yet," she said. He nodded, once. "Not because the answer is no." He was very still. "Because I have a rule about saying that kind of thing when the ground isn't level. When there are variables that aren't mine." She held his gaze. "When all of this is done, when I'm standing on my own 2 feet with no protection, no lash, no strategy, I will tell you what I think." She paused. "And I think you should know the direction it's going." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him recalibrate, not relief exactly, again, but something that went deeper than relief. A settling. Like a building finding its foundation. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay," she said. Lash was handled in the 3rd week of December. She didn't ask for details. She asked whether anyone was physically hurt, and Nikolai said it had been resolved through information rather than force. Documentation surfaced, certain people made aware of certain things, the kind of resolution that was still a resolution regardless of how clean it felt from the outside. The organization had stabilized. The threat to her specifically had been removed. He told her all of this on a phone call, his voice the same as always, even, direct, slightly weighted at the consonants. Then he said, "It's done." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for telling me. I told you I would." "I know." Another pause. "Are you all right?" A brief silence. "Yes," he said. And then, more quietly, better now. She had the protection removed the following day. The car on the block was gone by morning, and she stood at her window with her coffee and looked at the ordinary street and felt the return of her own ordinary life. The clean air of it, the privacy and the autonomy, the ground that was entirely hers. She texted Nikolai, "Free tomorrow evening?" He replied in under a minute, "Yes." She chose the restaurant. Not Alara, somewhere she had never worked, somewhere that was entirely neutral, no history, no theater. She arrived first and chose a table and sat with her water and her clear, uncomplicated evening, and when he came in, charcoal coat, no tie, that particular way he had of making a room aware of him without trying, she felt the warmth she had stopped trying to argue with. He sat down. He looked at her. He said nothing, which was his way. She said, "The ground is level." He understood immediately. She saw it in his face. "I'm in love with you," she said. Simply. Without decoration. I've been avoiding saying it because I have standards about context and conditions, but the context is resolved and the conditions are met, so I'm saying it now. She held his gaze. "Nikolai. I'm in love with you. You should know that." The stillness in him, that absolute, characteristic stillness, broke, just slightly, in a way that was more affecting than any outward display would have been. Something in him arrived, or returned, or found its way home to a place it hadn't been in a long time. His jaw moved. His eyes, those pale gray eyes, were the most human she had ever seen them. "I know," he said softly. "You didn't know." "I hoped." A pause. Hoping and knowing feel the same from the inside. She smiled at that, a real one, full and unhurried. "That might be the most romantic thing you've said to me. I have a limited repertoire. You have a perfect one." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, a simple gesture, deliberate, unhurried, hers. "We're going to figure this out," she said. "The world you live in, the world I live in, all of it. We're going to be honest about what's hard and what needs changing and what we're each willing to do. And it's going to be complicated." "Yes," he said. "And you're going to listen to me. Even when it's inconvenient." "I already do. Even more than that." A very small, genuine smile. "Yes." She looked at him across the table, the man who had stared at her from a corner table in October with the patient focus of someone who had recognized something and couldn't look away, who had asked for coffee without pressure, who had said, "I'm trying to have a conversation with someone who will tell me the truth," as if it were the simplest and most urgent request in the world. The man who had come down a December street in 8 minutes in a dress shirt. Who had said both things, "Your safety," and also "Please stay," and offered her the choice between them without weighting it. Outside the restaurant, the city was doing what cities do in December, lit up and moving, full of ordinary life carrying forward. "Table 7, she said. He tilted his head slightly. "That's what I called you in my head. Before I knew your name." She met his eyes. The man at table 7. He looked at her for a moment. "And now?" She squeezed his hand. "Now," she said, "you have a name." He turned his hand under hers and held it, firmly, quietly, completely. And neither of them said anything else for a moment, because some things don't require words. Some things are best held in the silence of two people who have decided, with full knowledge and full clarity, that the ground between them is worth standing on. Outside, December continued. Inside, something began. "Hi my loves. If you made it to the end of this story, I want you to know, genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, that it means everything to me. I wrote Maisie and Nikolai because I wanted to tell a love story where both people are fully themselves. Where she doesn't lose her backbone to fall in love, and he doesn't lose his complexity to become lovable. Where the power is real and the danger is real and the choice to stay is made with clear eyes and not in spite of knowing the truth, but because of it. I think that's the most romantic thing there is. Not the grand gestures. Not the swept off your feet, no questions asked surrender. But the moment where you know exactly who someone is, all of it, the weight and the shadow and the inconvenient reality, and you look at them and say, yes. Still. You. Maisie said yes. Not because she was naive. Because she was brave. And I hope that wherever you are tonight, reading or listening to this, you feel something like what she felt in that restaurant. That specific, quiet warmth of being seen, truly, fully, without performance, by someone who looked across a room and couldn't look away. Thank you for staying with me until the end. You're the reason I tell these stories. All my love. Always.